Section 2. The Sound Machine. Lonser believes that there are many sounds in the world which are inaudible to the human ear. He develops a machine to listen to them. One day, he takes the machine outside to test it and makes a startling discovery. It was a warm summer evening, and Losner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed, and he unlocked the door, went inside, and closed the door behind him. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. Against one wall, on the left, there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires and batteries and small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, the shape of a child's coffin. Losner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box, and started running his finger along the wires, tugging gently at them to test the connections, glancing back at the paper, then into the box, then at the paper again, checking each wire. He did this for perhaps an hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box, where there were 3 dials, and he began to twiddle them, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. All the while, he kept speaking softly to himself, nodding his head, smiling sometimes, his hands always moving, the fingers moving swiftly, deftly inside the box, his mouth twisting into curious shapes when a thing was delicate or difficult to do, saying,
"Yes, yes."
And now this one.
"Yes, yes. But is this right? Is it? Where's my diagram? Oh, yes, of course. Yes, yes. That's right. And now, good, good. Yes, 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 yes."
His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, breathlessness, of strong suppressed excitement. For a while longer, Losner fussed about with the wires in the black box. Then he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said,
"Now we'll try again. We'll take it out to the garden this time, and then perhaps the reception will be better. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my God, it's heavy."
He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down, carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the lawn. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine and put the earphones over his ears. The movements of his hands were quick and precise. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement, as though he were afraid that the machine might not work, and afraid also of what might happen if it did. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, starting at 15,000 and going on up to 10 lakh. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move. And in the earphones he could hear a faint, spasmodic crack. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself. But that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each car was connected to his head by a thin stiff wire like a tentacle, and that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up towards a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. The light needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door. And it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. Losner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand, and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away.
Mrs. Saunders!
Losner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement.
Oh, Mrs. Saunders!
And looking around, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn, a fantastic arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed.
Cut another one. Please cut another one quickly.
Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought. No, he's harmless. I'll just humor him. Certainly, Mrs. Losner, if you like, she said. She took her scissors from the basket and snipped another rose. Again, Losner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens.
All right,
he said.
That's enough. No more, please, no more.
The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him.
I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders.
He said.
Something that you won't believe.
He put his hands on top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles.
You have, this evening, cut a basket full of roses. You have, with a sharp pair of scissors, cut through the stems of living things. And each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders?
No, she said. I certainly didn't know that.
It happens to be true,
he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement.
I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard a cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it.
Did you really, Mr. Losner? She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds.
You might say
He went on.
that a rose bush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You'd be right. It hasn't. Not like ours, anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders? And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. How do you know that a rose bush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it?
Yes, Mr. Losner. Oh, yes, and good night. Quickly, she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Losner went back to the table. He put the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could still hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but wasn't sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain. It was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about. Something called toin or spurl or reluctant or anything you like. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him and walked up.
By Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl, 1916 to 1990, wrote books for children, short stories and poetry. His most loved books are Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda.